I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. You could say that. I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth. Do you believe in fate?
No.
Why not?
Because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
I know exactly what you mean. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there. Like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The Matrix.
Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window, or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
I do apologize for the somewhat dramatic introduction for those who thought it was unnecessary, and perhaps it was, but I think for a while now we've all come to realize that much of what's discussed in the so-called Manosphere and what we talk about and what I talk about on this channel is, for lack of a better word or term, red pill material. And I think we've all come to know that famous and iconic scene from The Matrix where Neo is offered the blue pill, the pill of ignorance, and the red pill, the one that makes you aware but maybe a bit unhappy as well. And I think we can all recognize the level of connection and that relevance, so I thought it was a fitting intro. And no, I'm not going to be talking much more about The Matrix, but the material I'm about to discuss now is quite eye-opening, I think, and highly relevant. And as usual, it is very much red pill material. Those who are afraid of red pill material, well, I can only offer a fair warning. Well, anyway, a little while back, not a week ago, I think, I made a video about solipsism, my own ideas about it, with regards to females and women and feminine behavior. Now, first let me thank I believe it's one of my subscribers or viewers by the name of AstroKidNJ. And he brought to my attention a link to a blog by a fairly prominent blogger who happens to be a PUA. And I want to talk somewhat extensively about PUA stuff and what have you, but later. Needless to say, it sounds a bit oxymoronic, but he is a married PUA, so make of that what you will. But PUAs, I'll get into this further a bit later. Let us not be mistaken that, in my opinion, oftentimes the intelligent and insightful PUA people, men, are really not that different to so-called or men going their own way, MG Toe. It's really in the conclusions that are reached that differ. I think both oftentimes are keen observers of human, specifically female biology, behavior, evolutionary psychology, and the like. So you can garner a fair bit of wisdom sometimes from stuff that is produced in the PUA community. It's, like I said, in the conclusions that we differ, and I will get into that later. He has a fascinating blog post entitled War Brides. Now, War Brides, it's a pretty dramatic title. What I'm going to do here, the guy's name, by the way, is Rollo Tomassi. Some of you might know him. I've read some of his material before, though I hadn't read this particular bit, and it's very, very eye-opening. It's sort of whatever gaps there might be, and admittedly there are lots of them, in my own solipsism theory of the female. It certainly fills in a large number of gaps there. And for all of us who've always wanted to know why it was that some of us were pining away for our exes, or at least took a long time to get over them, and why so many men commit suicide after relationships and marriages, and hardly a single woman does it, well, our answers might be found here. Needless to say, it is highly, highly plausible, though not based in hard facts, and I'll get to that later as well, as to why that's not the case, but it is highly, highly plausible and backed by, well, I would argue, thousands of pieces of anecdotal evidence, and I'm sure you can connect the dots for yourself, given your own personal experiences, you the viewer, of course. So I'm going to read this off. It's fairly short, and I will discuss it at length. I'm not a plagiarist, so full credit goes to Rollo Tomassi for this very, very insightful blog post. It's an angle of looking at female solipsism that I personally, I'm freely admitting here, had not considered to the extent that he had, and I think it is very, very valuable. And it's certainly noteworthy enough to talk about and comment on. So let's get started. So a poster one of his posters had prompted, on his blog, had prompted this response. It starts off, this is his poster, quote, "Evolution has largely selected for human females with the capacity to form psychological schemas that preserve an ego investment that would otherwise afflict them with debilitating anxiety, guilt, and the stresses that result from being continuously consciously aware of their own behavioral incongruities. Evolution selects for solipsistic women who are blissfully unaware of their solipsism," end quote. And then he goes on to ask, "Can you please expand on this, Rollo? I find it fascinating." So here's his blog post. "Okay, baton down the hatches. We're heading for dangerous waters. What I'm getting at here is suggesting that women's propensity for solipsism is a psychologically evolved mechanism. In other words, it helped women to cope with the harsh realities of the past, to develop a more focused sense of self-interest. To really grasp this, you need to understand women's brain function and chemistry. I'm not going to get too detailed in this, but suffice to say, numerous studies show that a female brain is hardwired for emotional response and communication on a more complex level than men. I think this is pretty much an established point for my readers, but if you disagree, well, that's going to have to be a topic of another post. Given the harsh realities that women had to endure since the Paleolithic era, it served them better to psychologically evolve a sense of self that was more resilient to the brutal changes she could expect to be subjected to. Consider the emotional investment a woman needs to put into mothering a child that could be taken away or killed at a moment's notice. Anxiety, fear, guilt, insecurity are all very debilitating emotions. However, it's women's innate psychology that makes them more durable to these stresses. Statistically, men have far greater difficulty in coping with psychological trauma. Think PTSD than women. Why should that be? On the face of it, you may think that men's better ability to rationally remove themselves from the emotional world makes them better at coping with psychological trauma, but the reverse is actually the case. Women seem to have a better ability to accept emotional sacrifice and move on, either ignoring those stresses or blocking them entirely from their conscious awareness. Women possessing a more pronounced empathetic capacity undoubtedly served our species in nurturing young and understanding tribal social dynamics. However, it was also a liability with regards to a hostile change in our environment. Stockholm Syndrome is far more pronounced in female captives. This is in brackets, the story of J.C. Dugard comes to mind. Why should that be? Because women's peripheral environment dictated the need to develop psychological mechanisms to help them survive. It was the women who could make that emotional disconnect when the circumstances necessitated, who survived and lived to breed with their tribes, when their tribes were decimated by a superior force. This is also known as the war bride dynamic. Women develop an empathy with their conquerors by necessity. Men are the disposable sex, women the preserved sex. Men would simply die in favor of a superior aggressor, but women would be reserved for breeding. So it served a feminine imperative to evolve an ability to cut form emotional ties more readily, this in brackets, in favor of the new captor, and focus on a more self-important psychology, solipsism. Now here's where I'll step off the diving board and into the theoretical. It's my purview that a whole lot of what men would complain are duplicitous acts of indifference towards them are really rooted in this innate feminine solipsism. That's a bold statement, I realize. But I'd argue that what men take for inconsiderate indifference is in a breakup or in ruthless shit tests is really a woman tapping into this innate self-preserving solipsism. Combine hypergamy with the chronically hostile environments of the past, and you end up with a modern-day feminine solipsism. Add to this an acculturated sense of female entitlement, social conventions that excuse this quote-unquote duplicity, and a constant misdirection of intent by women themselves, and you come to where we are now. As if that weren't enough, throw in the element of hypergamy and the countdown in terms of fertility and long-term provisioning that a woman must deal with before hitting the imminent wall, and wall is capitalized. And now you have a further picture of the conditions and stresses that necessitate this solipsistic nature. Ever wonder why it is a woman can get over you so quickly after a breakup from a relationship and you thought was rock solid for so long? Ever wonder why she returns to the abusive boyfriend she hopes will change for her? Look no further than female solipsism. After reading all this, I can understand if anyone thinks this is a very nihilistic observation. Let me be clear, this dynamic is real by order of degrees for individual women. A woman's conditions may be such that she's never needed to tap into this reserve. Also, we are dealing with subconscious elements of her personality here. So it would come as no surprise that feminine solipsism wouldn't be cognitive for most women, thus offensive and denied. I'm not asking that anyone accept this idea as gospel, just that the dots do connect very predictably, and that's the end of it. Well, I think they do connect very predictably indeed, and this really dovetails extremely well with what I had talked about in my previous video, the combination of neoteny as well as, essentially childlike psychology. Now, there has been some criticism or some questions as to possible conflation between solipsism and narcissism. Now, technically speaking, solipsism is a philosophical term, simply the belief that the self is the only thing that exists in the universe at the end of the day. That's all there is, the self. And I have taken some liberty, as has Mr. Tomassi, that in sort of expanding upon that. Now, I would argue that the fine distinction I'm making here between narcissism and solipsism is that the narcissist, in her worldview, or his or her worldview, to be PC, does acknowledge the personhood of others. It's just that they're inferior to him. Not so much with the solipsist. The solipsist doesn't view people as fully fleshed out persons. There's just sort of characters, like in a book or in a film. And so they lack that well, as I talked about in a previous video, that status of entityhood. They simply lack entity. They're not selves unto themselves. They are extensions at best of sort of, well, yeah, characters that would perhaps be in a drama. The narcissist does acknowledge the personhood of others. He or she simply thinks that they're just not really as good as he or she is, and I think that is the fine distinction. I think narcissism carries with it as well a streak of malice, and I do not, as this article alludes to as well, attach or ascribe malice to female solipsism. I think it's very, very plausible that this is an evolutionary mechanism that has been hardwired into female psychology, quite possibly to survive past duress and past dangers, as he talks about in the article. Now, I will post a link to this, but there was an interesting post where it was discussed the war bride mentality, how French women during World War II sort of shacked up with Nazi officers. So I think we actually can see this dynamic in fairly modern times as well. So it's not like it's completely undocumented. That this evolved as a evolutionary coping mechanism is extremely likely, but at the end of the day, we have that and we're sort of stuck with it. I want to distinguish now, and this could turn into a long video, I apologize for that, between blame and understanding. I am firmly convinced that there is such a thing as female nature, and that female nature is, by and large, not compatible with male nature in the sense that, yes, we are each other's vehicles of procreation, but we certainly do not exist within each other's spheres of interest, as it were. That our interests are, for the most part, well, in opposition, if not in some cases diametrically opposed to females. We have our own nature, and females have their own nature. But it's not a case of blame. Now, let me go into this a bit. Blame would be to cast faults on someone. Now, if I describe female solipsism, or Mr. Tomassi does as well, I think neither of us would say, well, it's women's fault. No, after all, if it's a hardwired psychological mechanism, and it appears to be so, it's no more their fault than, well, the fault of a starving tiger attacking a human being. And I want to further extend that analogy. If a starving tiger attacks a human being and tries to eat him or her, no one uses phrases or terms such as, well, it's the tiger's fault. We simply accept the nature of the tiger. We say, well, it's a starving animal, it's a starving beast, it needed food, sustenance, so it attacked someone. It makes sense, but people don't say, well, it's the tiger's fault. So too do I not place blame in that sense on women. I don't think that women are, well, evil. I don't use these terms. I wouldn't even use the term inherently flawed, which is something that's been thrown at me a couple of times. But they do have their nature, and just as one would be well advised to avoid a starving predator in the wild, my take is, well, not dissimilar to women in this case. So if we know that a starving animal, a starving predator, is potentially dangerous, there are a couple of strategies we can take. Well, not really. We usually try to avoid them. Or in the case we're actually being attacked, we have to use self-defense. Now, let's just stick with the idea of the wild beast, the wild animal. I see three different approaches in the so-called manosphere to dealing with this. And we all exist on different ends of the pole. So we have the traditionalists, who, in my opinion, are probably the least refined in their understanding of female nature. They appear to be the least interested in biology and human psychology, specifically female psychology and evolutionary theory, as well as its applications to understanding women. PUAs and MG Toe seem to have a lot more in common in that respect. Traditionalists simply, to the extent that they do acknowledge that hypergamy is an issue, think that it should be shackled, that it needs to be caged, and for a while this strategy did work. We had caged the beast. Civilization was able to, I suppose, take off for that reason, but it eventually came loose, and that's because, well, animals generally don't like to be caged. Now, those of you who don't like the analogy I make between women and animals, well, men are animals too. We're all just animals. The point is, I'm speaking of a sort of animalistic nature. That's why I'm referring to the object of discussion as an animal. So no, it didn't work out, and it's unlikely, and I've talked about a million times in the past, that we're going to return to that model. So let's move on to what I consider a bit more interesting. That is the distinction between PUAs and men going their own way. I think a lot of us, I see a lot of similarities here, because we both, it appears to be men going their own way on the whole, as well as some PUAs, to be interested in and keenly observed in understanding what female nature is. It's really in the consequences and the reaction to that nature that we differ. And the question is, well, how do we differ? Well, traditionalists believe that female nature should be shackled and caged. PUAs believe it can be sort of tamed, trained, and controlled. For example, you ever see circus animals? The same kind of thing. PUAs see female nature and think, well, I have this game theory, which is what they call, and with game theory I can control the beast. With game theory, the beast will be putty in my hands. Now, admittedly, some of the time that might be true. I mean, I'm not going to say that game theory is completely inaccurate and off base, but it certainly is not rocket science, and it's certainly not a hard formula for well, training, taming, and controlling female behavior, hypergamy or otherwise. And essentially what, in my opinion, you end up doing is just leaping through endless hoops, waiting. Well, it's a big mess. I think men going their own way, just look at both reactions to female nature, either shackling it, caging it, or trying to manipulate it, control it, as sort of futile. I know I do. Because you don't have that foolproof hard formula. And even if you did, well, I don't know, do you really want to be using a formula in your application every time you deal with women? I'm not sure if I in fact do want to do that. So I think there are a lot of similarities between PUAs and men going their own way. It's really in the conclusions. The other thing that why I'm not a PUA, why I've never even considered it, is because this idea of pedestalizing vaginal acquisition, wherein the vagina is still, the female is still put on a pedestal. I mean, at the end of the day, all game is really developing a bunch of theories, whether they're congruent or not, so as to better one's chances at acquiring pussy and getting laid, basically. That's what game is, game theory. You still pedestalize women. They're still the primary objects of your desire, and hence they have an elevated status regardless. So game theory, PUA, and so on and so forth, does nothing to diminish that status, which is something that I, in a dream world, because I know it's not going to change, would like to do. I would like to have men and women really of equal status. Now, I don't mean equal in ability, although that might be nice. It's even less attainable. But certainly this privileged status that the female has enjoyed for millennia and millennia, I would like to see that done away with. In particular because we've been operating under the notion that that the privilege that they've always enjoyed is actually not there, and they've been oppressed, so quite the opposite. Let me also say that and I think this is an important thing to note, just in general with all sorts of discourse, that just because someone has partially oppositional views, or views that may not coincide in some respects with some of yours, doesn't mean that they're completely off the mark in every case. So, for example, it's been cited accurately that Briefa's law, we know this by now, had, at the very least, strong communist sympathies, and that's true to the extent that I've read about it. But his communist sympathies, or his communist tendencies, do nothing to vitiate the accuracy of his observations of female hypergamy. The two are unrelated, any more than a world-class physicist doing experiments in a laboratory whose material is peer-reviewed and constantly subject to testing, who turns out to be a Nobel Prize winner and actually is worthy of the title, and so on and so forth. Maybe he has some really well, crackpot political views. The two are unrelated. So a person, I mean, in a lot of ways, you can see this as sort of partitioning or dichotomy of the mind, but often I think we can separate it. So just because I don't agree with, say, PUA's conclusions about this, all of this, doesn't mean I disagree with some of his analyses. And I think, like I said, in particular the case of this blog, it's really spot on that women really have developed this solipsism as a evolutionary mechanism, if you will, as a way of coping with what had occurred in the past. Now, I mean, that's a lot to take in, but I did mention this is sort of hardcore red pill material. One of the key elements in my assessment of solipsism is not being aware of your own solipsism, and this is why women can, this is, I think, the explanation as to why women can, without remorse, without any of this, can get away, in some cases, quite literally with bloody murder. When people are not fully fleshed out, when they have no person status, when they lack entityhood, true being, it doesn't really matter what you do to them. This is to be differentiated, of course, from narcissism. I mean, the narcissist does acknowledge the existence of other people. He or she just thinks that they're beneath him, and well, and he or she is a lot cooler than they are. But the question that arises from all of this, because this is, I mean, if this explanation is accurate, I think there's a lot of evidence suggesting that it is. What can be done about it? Well, or more importantly, can we draw upon our own examples? Well, I can, I'm a bit loath to talk about personal experiences sometimes because it's been sort of used against me, but pardon me, I'm a bit ill still. Regarding my own experiences, so I take a past, an ex-girlfriend who in one of her so-called parting emails had written something to the effect of me, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't feel like fishing that out again, that she had discovered a monster in herself and it scared her. Well, this is so, I think it is possible for women to be sort of self-aware to an extent, but in the same token, the same ex took the most expedient way of dealing with these things and just kind of swept everything under the rug, including me. So she acknowledged that her behavior was, at least to some extent, monstrous, but that was about it. And I'm pretty certain that you can, from your own personal experiences, draw on similar material. I have no doubt of that. There's just a lot of anecdotal experience and evidence to support this. Now, one thing that supports this and this gentleman's theory, I think, is the male suicide rates. Now, Girl Writes What had offered a theory of loss of identity, which I thought was quite plausible, and I think all of this is tenable, and there might be some kind of synergy between all of this as to why men are so devastated, say, in divorce or in relationship breakups. And I think this theory goes a bit further, and I think it has more expletive power. The reason being why women can simply get over relationships in the blink of an eye, why they have the next week a new boyfriend, and why men sometimes take years to get over them, and in some cases commit suicide. I mean, men are quite visibly, we know by the suicide numbers, devastated at marriage breakups, divorce, and relationship breakups, to varying degrees, of course. Women display this tendency, and we've all puzzled over it for all our lives. We just get over men, and it's not a big deal. And of course, that goes hand in hand rather readily with a solipsistic worldview. If your view of things is simply that everything out there is sort of, well, an extension of what's there to serve you, to service your needs, you don't. Another person's feeling certainly is not acknowledged, so that's kind of irrelevant. That's why I think we have the explanation as to why women don't have issues getting over their exes, why very few women, if any, commit suicide after divorce, and so on and so forth. And I think it's more tenable, or at least has more expletive power than the identity loss theory, but that's just my opinion. Now, On the one end of the spectrum, we have female solipsism. On the other end of the spectrum, we have what I would call men's commitment to reality. This is a fascinating thing because men, I think, are extremely non-solipsistic because men need to understand the world. It's part of our being. We seek to understand things. We wish to understand things sometimes on the molecular, sometimes even on the atomic level, some of us. We want to understand what's going on, mostly because we wish to effect changes on the world, upon the world, and that goes hand in hand. You cannot have a non-committal stance, i.e. a solipsistic stance, when you wish to effect changes upon the world, which can only be necessitated by understanding. And once again, we have the agency, hypoagency in play here. Now, this agency and this commitment to reality, the need to be knee-deep in reality, it can be seen in many respects as a double-edged sword. And one aspect of that double-edged sword that I'd like to talk about a bit is the consequences of that extreme commitment to whatever whatever the cause might be. Now, it is this extreme commitment to reality, this desire to effect change upon the world, the desire to understand, that has raised us forth from a state of savagery to the modern marvel of civilization that we have now. The fact that I'm able to make this video, the fact that you're listening, the fact that we have the internet, all of this is due to men's ingenuity, their commitment to reality, and their desire to understand and even manipulate reality, i.e. effect changes. The flip side of this coin, unfortunately, is when you're knee-deep in reality, it's kind of hard to get out of that reality. Just if you're knee-deep in quicksand, well, it's unlikely you're going to escape, or knee-deep in mud. It's going to be tough to get out of there. If you're solipsistic, you're not really knee-deep in anything. In fact, your position on virtually every aspect of life and every interaction in life is going to be one of non-commitment, non-committal. We see this consistently throughout female behavior. Women didn't want to vote initially because they didn't want to be drafted, and they were afraid that if they were gained the right to vote, they might be drafted and be forced to do military service. Remember, voting originally, and maybe I'll do a video on it at some point in time, was a trade-off. Of course, when they found out that they could get something for free, non-committal, mind you. No, commitment entails committing yourself to something, often in exchange for something else. They happily agreed to have the right to vote. So women, as a rule, are not, even though they talk a lot about commitment, we all know what's up with that. We don't need to talk about it anymore. We know they're full of shit. Their entire position on reality is one of non-commitment. A man, however, knee-deep in reality as he is committed. And this doesn't just apply to his activities or the things he does. This can apply to, well, what people, I guess, conventionally would call love, his feelings. Men, we know, are the so-called true romantics. They're the ones who value the feelings of their partners. They're the ones who who hold and esteem those feelings, who wish to make sure that their partners are doing well, are taken care of, if you will, that are feeling well. Since female solipsism inevitably results in some sort of parasitism that's simply not reciprocal. It's because of that level of commitment that the man will invest his feelings to the extent that he can, and that is a great extent, since men are creatures of commitment. They are beings that, with the entirety of their minds and their hearts, throw themselves into a situation and usually do their best. Because of that level of commitment, if it goes south, if a marriage goes south with his progeny, with his kids, can you imagine being knee-deep in reality as he is, what kind of effect that can have on men? Now, I would propose to you that that might be one of the primary reasons why men are offing themselves in record numbers after failed marriages and even after failed relationships, wherein women they just move on, because it never really meant anything to them anyway. To the extent that a relationship means something to a woman, or a marriage means something to a woman, well, the extent that it does mean something to her is the extent that the man is providing for her needs. And whether the man is providing for her needs or not, it's really the perception of that providing for her needs. The perception lies solely in the female's solipsistic world view in her eyes. It may or may not be an actual reflection of reality, but should any given female decide that her perceived needs are no longer being met, we can expect the divorce papers or the breakup phone call. Remember, these days, people, particularly women, they don't dump you in person. They call you on Skype. So, because it's a lot easier to do that. Besides, you wouldn't want to acknowledge the personhood of anyone else that would be non-solipsistic, just as an example. And yes, that was a personal example, but I thought it was quite telling. So, yes, this is one, in my opinion, a very, very plausible explanation of why men are much more likely to commit suicide. And also why he mentions PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, why men suffer much more egregiously, and though most women aren't even in wars from this. Now, for all our ability as men, collectively speaking, it's not that we lack, in my opinion, the ability to process these things. It's just that, well, going through life with the switch turned on, with an ability to be receptive to the nuances of life itself, to reality, to understanding whatever it is that exists in reality, be it mechanical engineering, music, the nature of language, whatever, mathematics. You need to be tuned into reality to do that. But the flip side of that is being tuned into reality can have really serious consequences, grave consequences, because the more tuned in you are, the more likely you are to suffer if that tuned-in state of tuned-inness, if you will, leads to disaster. And it can, of course, in the case of, say, a marriage that goes south, the kids are taken away, never mind the financial loss. But much more so than the loss of identity, it's that state of commitment, that drive, always to be knee-deep in everything that he does, that can often, in my opinion, in my observation, and based on what we have here and past thoughts, that can lead to these sort of astronomical suicide rates that you just do not see in women. You do not see it in women. No doubt a couple of women kill themselves after divorce, but it's just not, we have the statistics, I've done a video on this, it's just nowhere near the numbers of men. So, now, the PUA reaction to this is pretty funny, I think, because they think that all of this can be controlled, and I, quite frankly, don't think it can be controlled. I mean, any more than you can adopt a grizzly bear and you can do your best raising it. It's still a wild animal and potentially dangerous and to best be avoided. So it's not something that I think should be sought after. People can do whatever they want. I simply don't agree that game theory is so evolved and so complex and so offers so much power of explanation that it can actually be used to, well, it's really the goal, right? To manipulate women, to control them. I mean, running after chasing tail. I mean, chasing women and chasing tail. I just don't see anything lofty in that, but maybe that's just me. Now, I did want to make a couple of comments about evolutionary psychology and biology in general. You know, it's really interesting in my observation that biology not only is distinguished from so-called hard sciences in that, well, there's a lot, it's biology, we're talking about people here. I mean, there's a lot less math involved, mathematics, it's a lot more accessible, and anyone can really understand this. We can come up with our own theories that may well be plausible. I mean, look at what Mr. Tomassi did here. Look at what we've all done. You don't need a whole lot of mathematics. It's not really that arcane, and most of all, biology is really about us. And I think therein lies the rub. That is the problem, and I want to talk about that a bit. Whereas, on the other hand, you have something like well, certain branches of physics which are just so arcane that most of us will never understand them. One of my esteemed subscribers, the Lord of Caltech, as I refer to him sometimes, is a postgraduate student at Caltech, doing something extremely arcane involving statistics and physics, and the guy understood Fermat's theorem as a kid. It's never mind the fact that he's probably the best Chinese speaker of English I've ever encountered. The stuff he's doing, I freely admit, I don't understand and probably couldn't even if I tried. But we all can understand biology. It's readily accessible. You just need to read about it. It really just needs sort of, well, maybe a 3-digit IQ, and that's pretty much it. It's because of that accessibility that it is potentially dangerous. So, for example, people who don't like the evolutionary account of life, and remember, evolution doesn't explain abiogenesis so much as, well, how life evolved. It's because it's accessible to people that it's often misunderstood, or purposely misunderstood. And that accessibility, on the one hand, has its positive aspects, that we can construct our own theories and we can understand things for ourselves, but things can also be misconstrued. And what's unfortunate, I want to say, quite officially here, is that for all the vaunted progress we've made in the sciences over the years, particularly in biology and understanding how life has evolved, and particularly evolutionary psychology, which I think has a lot going for it, we are still blocked by political correctness. Now, I talked about hard evidence, and there was a feminist, I think, blogging or posted something on his blog or some other guy's blog asking for hard evidence. When does a feminist ask for that? Well, only when she's presented with a contrarian view that doesn't line up with her own worldview on female solipsism. Well, have been any studies done on this? Not to my knowledge. The reason being, it's just not popular. Can anyone imagine, in their right mind, imagine a front page article entitled "Female Solipsism Investigated and Confirmed Through Blah 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 Experiment," or even the science section of the New York Times or of any major newspaper? It simply wouldn't happen. We're dealing with a PR issue here. We're dealing with a bit politically correct. Women's behavior is excused, not apologized for, but is excused because we dodge the issues. If we're willing to accept an evolutionary account of certain things that have a massive evidence behind them, I think we also need to be in a position and willing to accept certain things that we might not want to hear. Now, for example, just as a creationist might not want to hear that we are apes, essentially, that we broke off from chimpanzees approximately 6 million years ago, a lot of people, particularly women, but also men, and I'm going to get to that in a bit, don't want to take the red pill. This is red pill material pure. If we're willing to accept certain conclusions about certain things with a lot of evidence backing it up, why not other things? Well, it's this political correctness. Women are constantly being shielded from exposure to the truth. And in the few instances where they do come close to the truth, as in, i.e., my ex, just as an example, acknowledging the monstrosity of her behavior to me in an email, well, they'd rather sweep that under the rug and move on. And of course, that is part of the solipsistic survival mechanism behavior, right? To be aware of your own abuses, to be aware of your own unethical behavior, is to feel remorse, regret. That is debilitating, and that's why. Another reason why men are plagued by a lot of these feelings. Oftentimes, that stark stance, that stark commitment to reality, inevitably can lead to such states of being, depression that far outweighs any kind of depression that women have ever experienced or are likely to experience. So, this is sort of a public relations issue, When a feminist asks, well, where's the hard evidence? Say, well, I'm sure it would be there. We just need more, well, biologists and evolutionary psychologists publishing material on this. I'll take a perfect example here, Richard Dawkins. I mean, the guy is obviously very intelligent. And depending on what he's talking about, I'm a big fan, depending on what he's talking about. I mean, Richard Dawkins knows what's up, and he was knee-deep in this whole elevator shaft business, which led to all this atheism plus blah, blah, blah. He knows what's going on. He's not an idiot. But he won't open up his mouth because he's afraid to lose his status. I mean, like many men, he's been sort of cowed into submission by well, feminists, and just by well, the inclination we all have to protect women, even though it leads to, well, the lack of disclosure of certain truths that should be promulgated much more often. Personally, I'd love to see Richard Dawkins in his last few years on this earth talk about this sort of thing, but I don't think it's going to happen. And so, yes, we're just left with what we have here: bloggers, YouTubers, offering not hard evidence, but which seems speculation, which seems to be substantiated by history as well. I'll be posting a link to both the blog entry as well as these French women who had liaisons with Nazi officers, and anecdotal evidence. And I, for one, would love to see some serious, rigorous science done on this. But like I said, the breaking news on the front page of a major newspaper, the likelihood that that's going to be women are hypergamous and solipsistic by nature. How do we address this? It's not going to happen, particularly in the charged, politicized, feminized atmosphere that we live in today's current day and age. So in summary, sometimes PUAs have some good material, and sometimes, well, like I said, it's not the analysis that we disagree with, it's really the conclusions. So for example, sorry, this is turning into a bit of a novel video. This guy's a married PUA, and I've read some of his other material. So he sees his job in marriage, or what he says, to be on top of his game. So he's running through hoops to, well, make sure his wife doesn't dump him or something to that effect. I don't really know. It's strange, but yeah, there's a lot of insight there, and certainly a lot more than the traditionalist one. But yeah, there you have it. A very, very insightful blog post. Some of the comments are quite interesting as well. And the Matrix, well, I think what's said in the Matrix by Morpheus is quite apt as well. Unfortunately, you can't be shown the Matrix. I see this all the time in comments in my videos, Barbara Russ's videos, and others. Even in response to Girl Rights Watch, who people would argue are the best out there. Well, depends on who you ask. But anyway, people who are not willing to come to terms with reality, who would prefer the Matrix, they're not going to see it. They're not going to take the red pill, and maybe they're even incapable of taking the red pill. Some of what Morpheus talks about, of course, is also pertinent in the sense that his whole life had felt that some sort of incongruities with his life and what was going on. Everything, paying taxes, to going to church, to his job, to work, to everything. I mean, I really think we're equipped with a mentality that's willing to accept the red pill stuff, no matter how unpleasant it might be or not. And so another reason I thought that intro was pretty apt. Anyway. I've talked a lot, and I hope I haven't said much about nothing, to sort of slightly paraphrase from the Shakespearean title of the play. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you profited from it. Like I said, this blog post is extremely insightful. It explains a great deal, and I would strongly urge you to read it yourself And some of the comments as well are insightful and interesting. And like I said, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because some conclusions reach or some views don't line up with yours doesn't mean that everything a person says is to be thrown out. Like I said, no one's going to, on rational grounds, reject Brifo's law with regards to a theory of hypergamy in reference to females, no matter what his communistic tendencies might have been. They're really separate issues. Okay, thanks for watching, and I will see you all, well, soonish rather than laterish, hopefully. Take care.